A lot of people think that when you tell a persuasion story, the persuasion story has to close the deal. And it doesn't. What I like to say is it moves the prospect closer. Getting over objections is one of the most important steps in closing a sale. And in the process, you're giving an example that obliterates an objection.
Is there a formula, like a must-have to all those kind of writing commandments?
You generally want to have a crisis, an obstacle, a way the person overcame the obstacle, and a positive resolution. That's a lot like a typical hero's journey story. Stories get translated into pictures in people's minds. And if the picture is too ornate and detailed, they're not going to be able to process it before you move to the next point in the story. Sometimes people are pushing too hard in the story, and you don't need to push. You're just moving people gently from where they are to I want it.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Duct Tape Marketing Podcast. This is John Chance, and my guest today is David Garfinkel. I messed his name up. It's Garfinkel. Yeah. Sorry about that. Okay. We do one take here, so you're going to have to live with that, David.
I'll live with
it. He's a renowned copywriting expert, author, and coach, widely regarded as one of the world's leading authorities on persuasive communication. Spent decades helping businesses, entrepreneurs, and marketers craft compelling messages that drive results. We're going to talk about his latest book, The Persuasion Story Code, The Magic of Conversational Storytelling. So, David Garfinkel, welcome to the show.
Thanks, John.
So, before we get into the content of the book, storytelling's become a pretty hot topic, especially in marketing circles. Number of books. I've interviewed a number of authors that have written about it. So I always like to start with, what do you feel like you offer that's different in this book?
Well, to put it bluntly, I offer stories that people can learn quickly and use immediately that aren't going to put their listeners to sleep or go, what is he talking about?
Let's dive right into that. You have, 25 or so what you call mini story frameworks.
Yeah, I call them persuasion stories, and they are actually stories we tell every day, but we don't realize it. And sometimes when we tell them, they're not as persuasive as they could be. I show you how to make them persuasive without coming across like a carnival barker, but just like a normal human being telling a story.
Can you give me a couple of examples of how you would apply some of those story frameworks particularly in marketing circles?
Sure. Well, let me turn the tables on you for just a second for the first one. An empathy story, So, John, I know you do a podcast. I do one too. And sometimes it can be stressful because the guest doesn't show up, or they get tongue-tied and they're tripping over their words. And it's always a good idea to have a backup, a way to get yourself out of it. That's what I call an empathy story. Now, you're obviously an experienced guy, and you probably have a dozen backups or workarounds. But I mean, even as I was saying that to you, didn't you feel like I knew you just a little better?
Sure. No question. That, most podcasters have been through the same thing. So yeah, absolutely.
And I want to point out that story has a beginning and a middle, but it doesn't have an end. It opens the door for me to sell you my brand new $10,000 course, backups and workarounds for tongue-tied guests, right? Which, of course, is a joke. And I don't really have that.
That would be a short course, right?
Exactly.
So you introduced the idea, you've probably trademarked this even, of stories with a $sign to start the S. You want to talk a little bit about that concept?
Yeah. So what most people think of stories, they think of a novel. They might think of an Orphan X novel. I love those novels myself. Or, a Lee Child, Jack Reacher novel, or maybe an 18th century Emily Bronte novel or something. 19th century, I guess. Those are very long stories. And I call them stories with a $sign because we have to pay money to read them, to see them. Even cable TV movies, we're paying a cable bill, or we're paying some kind of bill for that. And so those cost us money, and usually well worth it. But that's why it has a $sign instead of an S at the beginning. Stories, the other type, persuasion stories, are stories that make us money, stories that help us build trust, build rapport. And in some cases, certain kinds of stories close sales. And they're much shorter. They're much simpler. They don't have lots of characters and character development and an inner journey and an outer journey and, mentors and villains and all that stuff that you need for an entertainment story, the story with a dollar sign. Otherwise, why would anyone bother paying for it if it's not interesting?
That story you started with, the empathy story, is that something that, particularly when it comes to resonating with the target audience that you're trying to attract? I mean, is that an essential piece of even getting started?
It's one way to do it. I think it's the best way. There are other ways. You can cite statistics. You can talk about, there's another kind of story called a story about what's going on in the world today. A lot of people in the financial marketing space call this a top of mind story because it's about the news and it connects with what the person's thinking, but it doesn't always connect with what they're feeling. Now, if it's very pitched, if it's political about a point that your target market strongly agrees with, then it does have an emotional connection.
How do you make stories? I mean, you see people trying to do this and they come off sort of canned. How do you make a story feel very conversational? I mean, do you have some elements that you bring to that, or is that just you're a good writer, or you just intuitively know this? I mean, how do you get that conversation element?
Well, sometimes it takes practice, and some people are better at this naturally than others.
Right.
But basically, if you're talking about something you already know, whether it's about yourself or your product, or most likely about your prospect and their pains or their dreams or their hopes or some imagined future that you can provide for them, deliver to them, it'll come across more naturally. It's really when you try to be someone you're not. You remember Hal Holbrook, and he did all the Mark Twain stuff. I mean, there's a professional storyteller. My gosh, he spent years and years honing his craft and probably spent hours in makeup making himself look like Mark Twain and all the rest. That's not what you do as a business person, unless you're in the entertainment business. It's what you do as a salesperson is you talk to people. You talk to them about what they need, about their problems, about a solution that you have, and to deliver the same information you're already delivering conversationally, but in a story form, it's just going to work a little better.
So a lot of what you're talking about, selling, is getting the order. So you tell a story, you get some rapport, bring in some empathy, but ultimately you have to say, buy now. So how do you work a call to action in that kind of meets the same meter as the story?
Well, the interesting thing is a lot of people think that when you tell a persuasion story, the persuasion story has to close the deal.
Right.
And it doesn't. What I like to say is it moves the prospect closer. So you can tell a story that eliminates objection. Some people think that this $10,000 podcast workaround course isn't for them. But let me tell you about George. He was always getting these guests that started drooling when they come to this podcast. And we taught them how to get them to actually wipe the saliva off their mouth before. Okay, terrible example, but you get the point. You're just telling about something that happened. And in the process, you're giving an example that obliterates an objection. So getting over objections is one of the most important steps in closing a sale. There is one story I have in there, and I don't remember the official name I gave it, but the shorthand is the choice of one, where it basically eliminates all the other alternatives. You can tell that story, talk about how all of the competition doesn't do this, but we do, doesn't do this, but we do, doesn't do this, but we do. And that can be pretty close to, okay, would you like one? Are
the stories that you are explaining in the book that need to be in print, need to be spoken, or there differences to the medium or to the where they're encountered?
No difference. I mean, I'm of the school, direct response marketing, that copy is basically the spoken language in written form. So anything written in copy could be spoken out loud. And so the words would be the same. Now, there are other people I know who think that copy needs to be big and bold and flamboyant. And I think that's more like a story with a dollar sign. It's very entertaining, but in my experience, it rarely works in actually getting new customers.
Can you use this technique to get attention? I know one of the chores for a lot of marketers is just people have shorter attention spans. The world is cluttered. Search engines take people where they want to take them. I mean, can you use this to really get that initial attention in your view?
Sure. There are 4 types of origin stories that I have in chapter 3, and any one of those could very easily get attention. The coffee that I'm drinking here is made with my favorite device in the world, the Arobi AeroPress. Costs about $30, and it makes delicious coffee. And I actually include their origin story, which is not all that dramatic, from their website. But if you wanted to get more attention, you could say, that was the last cup of coffee at the office I could take, burned, flavorless. I was going out of my mind. And then I thought, and that will get someone's attention. And then he can describe how he invented and tested and perfected and rolled out and offers this Arobi AeroPress for $39 as opposed to $2,000 for an espresso machine. It makes better coffee. So you can use origin stories to get attention. You can also use an empathy story if you start talking about somebody's pain. You could be you're selling a remedy for joint pain. You could say, you wake up in the morning and once again, you dread to get up, not because you're sleepy, because you know that your joints are going to hurt and soon it starts to feel like sandpaper. Somebody who is in the market for something to get rid of that feeling is going to pay attention.
Does a story in this format have a headline? Does it need to have a headline? Well,
the story is a component of a sales pitch or of a sales letter. So the sales letter probably should have a headline. Yeah. In fact, you can even start your story in the headline. I mean, one of the most famous ads ever was the John Cable's ad. They laughed when I sat down at the piano.
I knew that's
but when I began to play,
right.
And then he actually develops the story. It's about 1/6 of the whole ad. So it's not a long story, but it's a failure, success, problem, solution kind of story. He wrote it about 101 years ago, and we still talk about it.
Yeah. So what are some of the biggest mistakes that you see people making when really trying to persuade through storytelling?
Oh, TMI, too much information. They try to tell everything. They can go into way too much technical detail. I mean, stories get translated into pictures in people's minds. And if the picture is too ornate and detailed, they're not going to be able to process it before you move to the next point in the story. Also, sometimes people are pushing too hard in the story. And you don't need to push. You're just moving people gently from where they are to I want it. And sometimes there's no momentum at all. The story is just sort of sitting there and it's not focused. It's going around in circles and it's not very persuasive.
Can people learn, how would you tell, obviously your book gives them a lot of training, but I think the best writers, maybe you agree with this, the best writers are commonly readers of a lot of things. Can we learn anything from that our favorite fiction works?
Yeah. So about 100 years ago, I don't know why I keep bringing up these old examples. I guess I'm feeling old today.
It's because that's when we started in business as well.
Exactly. Good point. Touche. There was an actor. I don't remember her name, but she was C.B. DeMille's filmmaker, favorite actor. And she said that and I'm paraphrasing, every scene in a movie is a story. So if you realize the kind of stories we're talking about with persuasion stories are little bricks that build the wall of a whole story with a dollar sign. And so I think my go-to favorites are Stephen King, Lee Child, who wrote the Jack Reacher books, Greg Hurwitz, who wrote the Orphan X books. All of those guys, they write very tight, moving, and I don't just mean emotionally moving. I mean, there's some momentum in the story. They write little snippets of things that happen, little scenes that are complete stories in themselves. And those are really good examples. I had one client who was a crazy Jack Reacher fan. and he was having trouble with some stuff. And I told him, get 5 or 6 of your favorite Jack Reacher books and just copy the first page. Hand copy it word for word, not to use in anything, not to violate copyright, not to be a plagiarist, but just to get a sense of the rhythm and the tone and the feel. And he did, and it transformed him.
I was going to ask you for a success story, but that's a pretty good one right there. Let's talk a little bit about AI and storytelling.
Sure.
Automation. I mean, is this going to complement or hinder what you're teaching?
Both. So I'm taking, the book, the Persuasion Story Code, and I'm creating a video course, which is going to be much more thorough. And I've been working with Rhonda Lynn. She's been helping me develop an AI feature to go behind the paywall, inside the course. And what I am insisting that it do, even though it doesn't want to, it wants to write the stories. I don't like stories that AI writes. It generally screws them up. And sometimes it makes up facts that you won't catch, and that can get you in trouble with your customers or with regulators. But what I'm having it do is draw out of the person key points in the story so that you come up with an outline in your own words through a conversation with the AI. And I prefer to use AI that way a lot, where I'm very good at interviewing people, but I also enjoy being interviewed. As you can tell, you're interviewing me right now. And I enjoy having a conversation with an AI when it asks me good questions. So you'll basically answer 6 questions with a single sentence, and it'll arrange those sentences for you, and you have the outline of your story. I think the problem with AI writing in general and writing stories in specific is there's something that, whether you're good at writing stories or writing copy or writing conversationally or not, you and everyone else has a life experience, has had a lot of conversations with people, has a spidey sense, what's real and what's phony. AI knows what it's been fed in its training by its developers. And sometimes the stuff it comes up with, plus AI seems to have this, I don't know, it's algorithm or tendency to want to make everything better and inspirational at the end, even if that's not what you want to do. And so you end up editing it, and you could end up spending more time editing it than you would have if you'd written in the first place.
Well, I'm really happy to hear you describe it that way, because I've been saying for a long time that our job now is going to be provide context. And I think that that's really what you're describing, because it can't do that.
It really can't. Now, you can do more of that than you might have imagined by giving it rules. But even figuring out what those rules are is quite a mental strategic exercise in itself. And then communicating it, figuring out how to communicate it so it's effective to the AI, is also an exercise in itself. But you can do more with AI and get higher quality output than you thought. When it comes to something like stories, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think you just have to treat it as that assistant, is what I've told people. You can even, I've had a lot of luck with, never had luck with saying write something, but have had good luck with saying, could you make this sentence better? Things along that line, and then it will bring in lots of stuff because you've trained it. Is there a formula, like a must-have? You must have an object of desire. There must be a climax. There must be, all those kind of writing types of commandments
for stories.
Yeah.
Well, these stories are different. In a typical hero's journey story, there are those rules. But a hero's journey story is 2 hours long and has many pieces to it. There are specific rules, but they're different for an origin story than they are for an empathy story. An empathy story, all of the story, there are 4 types, and I call them stories about what your customer is experiencing. Those generally only have a beginning and a middle. There are case study stories, and with case studies and other proof stories, testimonials that are effective, you generally want to have a crisis, an obstacle, a way the person overcame the obstacle, and a positive resolution. And that's a lot like a typical hero's journey story, sort of shrunken down to 2 or 3 minutes. So it depends.
I'm curious, who did you read? Who did you learn from? when you were getting started?
In storytelling?
Well, or copywriting period.
Oh my gosh. Well, Gary Halbert was the guy.
Right.
I read all his newsletters. I went to one of his seminars, which changed my life. Hurricane Andrew.
From Fish Creek or something like that. Where did you write from? I can't remember what the.
Well, he was in Key West, but he was south of something, Jewfish Key or something like that. Yeah. But I read all the classics. I read Scientific Advertising 15 times. It's not even a very enjoyable book, but incredibly valuable. I like Gene Schwartz's book a lot, Breakthrough Advertising. Yeah. I've been reading it for 30 years. I still keep getting new things out of it. I love Joe Sugarman's book. It was originally called Advertising Secrets of the Written Word. It is reissued at a much better price by Adweek magazine, and it's, I think, now called the Adweek Copywriting Guide. And that's one of my top books. So I've read a lot of copywriting books. A few of them have been really good, like those.
So, David, I appreciate you taking a moment to stop by the podcast. Where can people find out more about your work? Certainly learn more about the frameworks, and obviously pick up a copy of the Persuasion Story Code. I've been sick with a headache today, and so I'm like,
that's okay. That's okay. No, you're doing great. Thank you. Persuasion Story Code. Persuasion Story Code is available on Amazon. The Persuasion Story Code, because some people look for the Persuasion Code, which is a different book. You can find me on LinkedIn and Twitter X or Twitter. And I have a podcast myself, Copywriters Podcast. You find it at copywriterspodcast.com. We're also on all of the platforms, Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all the rest. If someone has a fairly robust business, or they're doing pretty well as a copywriter and they want coaching, they can go to garfinkelcoaching.com. I think that's about it. I don't know.
Awesome. Well, again, I appreciate you taking a few moments out of the day to stop by the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me. My pleasure. Great questions too.
Thank you. Hopefully we'll run into you one of these days out there on the road.
That sounds good. I like that.